The soldier looked American. He wore American clothes. He drove an American Jeep. He spoke passable English. But the moment the military policeman at the checkpoint asked him a simple question, a question any real American would answer without thinking, the whole disguise fell apart. It wasn't a question about troop movements. It wasn't a question about military codes. It was about baseball. And it ended with a firing squad. By the winter of 1944, Germany was losing the war on every front. Allied armies were pressing in from the west. Soviet forces were advancing relentlessly from the east. Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated and desperate, hatched a plan to reverse everything in a single, violent stroke. He called it his last gamble. On October 22, 1944, Hitler summoned one of his most audacious soldiers to his headquarters in East Prussia. SS Colonel Otto Skorzeny had already built a reputation as a man who did the impossible. He had rescued the deposed Mussolini from a mountain fortress. He had kidnapped the son of Hungary's regent to keep that nation in the war. Now Hitler had something even more radical in mind. Germany would launch a massive surprise offensive through the forested Ardennes region of Belgium, the same route that had produced stunning victory in 1940. The goal was to split the American and British armies, drive to the crucial port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets reached Berlin. For the plan to work, German forces needed to cross the Meuse River before Allied engineers could blow the bridges. Speed was everything. Skorzeny's assignment? Get to those bridges first. And to do it, his men would wear American uniforms. Skorzeny understood immediately what that meant. Under the 1907 Hague Convention, soldiers captured fighting in enemy uniforms were not protected as prisoners of war. They could be tried and shot as spies. He raised this concern with senior commanders. Hitler dismissed it, claiming the tactic was legal as long as his men removed enemy uniforms before opening fire. Skorzeny accepted the mission. He had no real choice. An order went out to every German headquarters on the Western Front, requesting English-speaking volunteers for a secret commando operation. The request was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel himself. Within days, it had been intercepted by Allied intelligence, who dismissed it as a deliberate German deception. They couldn't believe anyone would advertise a secret operation so openly. The volunteers who answered the call arrived at a remote training facility in Bavaria, cut off from the outside world. One soldier was shot for writing too many details in a letter home. Most had no idea what they'd actually signed up for. What Skorzeny found when he assembled his force was somewhere between alarming and absurd. Of the roughly 2,500 men gathered, only about 10 spoke English with genuine American fluency. The idioms, the slang, the rhythm of casual American speech. Another 3 or 4 dozen spoke decent English, but had no real feel for how Americans actually talked. The rest could barely manage a sentence. The equipment situation was no better. Skorzeny had requested 15 Sherman tanks, 100 jeeps, and large quantities of authentic American uniforms. What arrived was a handful of worn, mismatched clothing, some British, some Polish, some Russian, many bearing bloodstains or prisoner of war markings. The only tanks that showed up were German Panthers with sheet metal disguises, olive drab paint, and hastily painted white stars. Skorzeny himself later admitted they might fool very young soldiers from a considerable distance in the dark. His best English speakers, perhaps 10 or 20 men, were organized into small commando teams under SS Captain Ernst Motzek. These were the ones who actually had a chance of pulling it off. They trained obsessively in the compressed weeks before the offensive. They memorized American military ranks, unit insignia, and drill customs. They watched American films. They studied sports teams, Hollywood gossip, current popular songs, and brand names. They practiced walking differently, smoking differently, holding themselves the way Americans held themselves. Their missions fell into 3 categories: demolition teams targeting bridges and fuel depots, reconnaissance units scouting American positions and passing false orders, and lead teams working ahead of the German advance, cutting communications and spreading confusion. They all understood what capture meant. The offensive began before dawn on December 16, 1944. More than 200,000 German soldiers surged out of the forested Ardennes along an 80-mile front. The assault achieved total surprise. American forces, stretched thin across a quiet sector they considered a rest area, were overwhelmed. 4 divisions, some fresh and untested, others exhausted from earlier fighting, faced 30 German divisions supported by nearly 1,000 tanks. In the chaos of the first hours, Skorzeny's commando team slipped through. Dressed in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps, they moved freely behind American lines. One team drove straight into an American-held town, mapped every defensive position, and on the way out, redirected an armored convoy down the wrong road. 2 other teams successfully misdirected supply columns. Road signs were reversed. Telephone wires were cut. False rumors spread like fire through dry grass. German breakthroughs deeper than the actual penetrations. Phantom threats in directions the enemy wasn't advancing. The missions were real. The disruption was real. But then, everything began to unravel. On December 17th, a jeep rolled toward a checkpoint outside a small Belgian town. Sergeant William Creel raised his hand. 3 soldiers in American uniforms sat inside, carrying what looked like American weapons, speaking English that sounded almost right. Creel asked for the password. There was a hesitation. He asked again. The English stumbled. Then he noticed the weapons. Sten guns, British-made submachine guns. No American patrol carried those. Within minutes, all 3 men were under arrest. Underneath their American uniforms, they wore German field gray. Under interrogation, one of the 3 made a statement that changed everything. He claimed the operation wasn't just about bridges. He claimed there was a mission to infiltrate Supreme Allied headquarters and kill General Dwight Eisenhower. Whether he believed this himself, or was deliberately spreading disinformation, or simply said something that spiraled out of control, no one knows. No credible evidence ever emerged that such a plot existed. The actual objective was always the Meuse bridges. But it didn't matter. The statement was passed up the chain of command, and within hours, the entire Allied rear area went into a state of controlled panic. Eisenhower found himself effectively imprisoned in his own headquarters. Guards were tripled. Everyone entering the building was stopped and questioned. Eisenhower, one of the most powerful military commanders in the world, could barely leave his own office. He reportedly grew furious at the confinement, eventually declaring that he was going out and didn't particularly care what happened to him. But the paranoia had already spread far beyond protecting a single general. Checkpoints appeared everywhere. Every road, every intersection, every bridge crossing became a security gauntlet. Military policemen stopped every vehicle and questioned every occupant. And the questions they asked were not what anyone expected. What's the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series in 1940? What team plays at Wrigley Field? Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What position is the guard in a football formation? Who is Frank Sinatra married to? What's the name of the president's dog? These weren't intelligence questions. They were trivia questions. The kind of knowledge Americans soaked up without trying, absorbed from childhood through radio programs and sports pages and movie theaters and schoolyard conversations. The kind of knowledge that couldn't be studied from a manual in 3 weeks. The system was chaotic, improvised, and frequently absurd. General Omar Bradley, one of the most senior American commanders in Europe, was detained at a checkpoint after correctly identifying Springfield as the capital of Illinois. The military policeman was convinced the answer was Chicago. Bradley had to wait while his identity was verified through other channels. Brigadier General Bruce Clark was held at gunpoint after stating that the Chicago Cubs played in the American League. They don't. But the soldier didn't know that either, and the confusion was enough to get Clark arrested. One captain spent a week in detention after MPs discovered he was wearing German boots taken as a battlefield souvenir. British officers fared even worse. When a reconnaissance officer was asked who had won the 1940 World Series, he replied honestly that he had absolutely no idea. He was detained until someone vouched for him. Dozens of British soldiers who couldn't answer questions about American baseball or American geography were pulled from their vehicles and held until their nationalities could be confirmed. Some American soldiers, offended at being interrogated by junior enlisted men, deliberately gave wrong answers in protest. They were detained too. Supply convoys sat idle at checkpoints for hours. Reinforcements headed toward threatened sectors arrived days late. Unit commanders found their orders questioned by subordinates who no longer trusted that anyone around them was who they claimed to be. The 17 days between December 16th and January 1st saw 23 Operation Greif participants captured. 16 of them were caught before the new year. The trials were swift. The first began on December 21st, just 4 days after the initial capture. The evidence was plain. American uniforms, German uniforms worn underneath, German weapons, German identification. The Hague Convention's position was clear. These men were not prisoners of war. They were combatants, captured in enemy uniform while conducting military operations. All 3 of the first defendants were convicted and sentenced to death. On December 23, 1944, 2 days before Christmas, the sentences were carried out. An American medical officer pinned paper targets over the condemned men's hearts. Blindfolds were applied. A firing squad raised their rifles. One of the 3 shouted his loyalty to Hitler at the moment of execution. Then it was over. 13 more executions followed at military installations in Belgium before the month ended. Young men, most in their 20s, who had volunteered for a mission they had barely understood, who had been given inadequate training and implausible equipment, who had been sent into the field wearing uniforms that could get them shot. The last member of the operation to be tried wasn't executed until June 1945, weeks after Germany's unconditional surrender. In total, 17 participants in Operation Greif died before firing squads. Skorzeny himself survived. He had been wounded by artillery shrapnel during conventional fighting in late December, after the operation's original objectives had already been abandoned. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945 and spent 2 years awaiting trial at Dachau. In 1947, he and 9 of his officers faced a military tribunal on charges of improperly using enemy uniforms. His defense rested on a single distinction. His orders specified that the disguises were for infiltration only. His men were instructed to remove American uniforms before engaging in combat. He had not ordered his men to fight while disguised. In a surprise move, the defense called a British Special Operations officer who testified that Allied forces had used identical tactics, wearing German uniforms behind enemy lines in France. The tribunal acquitted Skorzeny and all 9 co-defendants. The verdict was controversial. 17 of his men had died for doing what he was acquitted of ordering. The difference came down to timing and evidence. The executed men had been caught in the act. Skorzeny, tried 2 years later in peacetime, could demonstrate the legal framework behind his orders. In 1948, Skorzeny escaped from an internment camp. Men dressed as American military police walked him out the gate. Whether American intelligence knew about or permitted the escape has never been definitively established. He eventually settled in Spain and died of cancer in 1975. He never expressed regret. The Battle of the Bulge continued without him. Surrounded at Bastogne, American defenders of the 101st Airborne refused to yield. When German officers delivered a formal surrender demand, the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a response that became one of the most famous single words in American military history: nuts. When the German officers asked what it meant, they were told it was the equivalent of go to hell. Patton's Third Army executed an almost impossible 90-degree turn and drove north to break the siege on December 26th. By early January, Allied counterattacks had pushed the German penetration back. The battle officially ended January 25, 1945. More than 1 million men had fought in it. American casualties exceeded 80,000. German losses were comparable, but Germany had no way to replace them. Hitler had committed his last reserves and lost everything. Within 4 months, the Third Reich was finished. Operation Greif had failed completely on its own terms. Not a single bridge was captured. Not a single major demolition was carried out. A few road signs were turned around. Some phone lines were cut. A handful of convoys were misdirected. The operation's tactical results were almost nothing. And yet, the fear it created, the suspicion, the chaos, the paranoia that turned every American soldier into a potential enemy, disrupted Allied operations during the most critical days of the entire German offensive. Eisenhower was isolated from the front. Reinforcements arrived late. Commanders second-guessed everything and everyone around them. All of that from an operation that never really worked. The men at the checkpoints asking about baseball didn't know they were making history. They were solving a practical problem. How do you identify someone who looks right, sounds almost right, but isn't actually who they claim to be? Their answer? Test knowledge that can only be absorbed through a lived American childhood, not studied in a crash course, turned out to be exactly right. Language can be learned, uniforms can be copied, accents can be practiced, but you can't fake growing up. The 17 graves at the German military cemetery in Lommel, Belgium, hold young men who discovered that truth at the worst possible moment. They had studied, they had trained, they had memorized facts about a country they'd never lived in. When the questions came, it wasn't enough.